you, everyone. I'd ask you to please take your seats. Thank you very much. Thank you. We're going to get going. If you can, please take your seats. The sooner we get going, the more we will not eat into lunchtime. There you go. Thank you very much. Please, can I just ask you all to just check your mobiles are switched to silent. Thank you very much. We're going to go straight into the next session, which is all about the challenges and solutions and the impacts of fisheries and bycatch, where there seems to be a significant lack of data, but we're going to hear about the problems and hopefully some solutions as well, just as we did in the last session, which was particularly inspiring. So I'm delighted to introduce the first speaker, Sophie Elliot, of the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. Dr. Elliot is the senior fisheries scientist there, where she leads research on salmon conservation. She completed her PhD in the University of Glasgow back in 2016 and undertook 6 years of postdoctoral work dedicated to the conservation of threatened, once commercially exploited species. And she's also worked for the government and with the fishing industry to implement conservation measures for protected species. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ella. All right, get started. I think everyone can hear me and I don't fall off the stage. So today I'm going to talk about bycatch, which is the non-targeted catch from commercial fisheries. So here we're focusing really on the marine side of things. So you've all heard a lot about Atlantic salmon, which is really echoey. Which is a part of a group of species called diadromous fish, most of which are threatened, as you can see here. Now, we know a lot about each of these species in their freshwater environments, as we've heard over the last few days, but some of these species spend over half their lives out at sea, and we really don't know very much about them at all. So this is a slide that Alan also showed, basically all the different salmon rivers that are identified by NASCO and the incredible migration that these species undertake. So we know that they're in decline, and the reason for this, many, in the previous presentation spoke about survival on the River Frome where we work, it is also pointing to marine survival being the biggest impact. They're an important species, we know this, they're protected by national and international law, but yet we're still not doing anything about it. We've seen presentations yesterday showing the high economic value and societal importance. They're an indicator species. The minute the environment changes, these are one of the first species to react to this changing environment, and as we heard yesterday, they can recover, in addition to their incredible migration. So what can we do to reduce these pressures? So at present, there's no annual dedicated salmon research at sea. It all occurs in the rivers, but there are sources of data that we can look into. The first one being Fisheries observer data. Now, this occurs to monitor bycatch, monitor targeted fisheries, and basically scientific observers, they board upon fishing vessels and they look at everything that's landed. They identify the species, measure the size of them, the weight, etc., etc. Now, I've worked at arm's length on a project on the European sturgeon. Now, although this data should be roughly 2% of all fishing vessels, it mainly is on demersal vessels where there's more bycatch than pelagic vessels, which is most diadromous fish. Now, on the European sturgeon, from 20 years of data of Fisheries observer data, they only managed to get 3 records of the critically endangered sturgeon. But when they went out and called out to fishermen and said, please, we need to understand whether you're catching any of these species, in just under 10 years, they managed to get 300 records of bycatch. So there's clearly underreporting going on. Then you've got onshore observations. So this is people that go on the fish markets and they look through and see whether a species is correctly labelled. Now, I've worked on this on a different species, and what happens is the fish's head is cut off, their fins are cut off, their tails are cut off, they're turned on their back, and they're labelled as something entirely different. Now, In the UK data, we've tried to access data, there's almost nothing on it. There's not enough of these observers. Then fishermen carry out logbook data. Now, they've got a lot on their plates. Under 12-metre vessels, it's meant to be all handwritten. They're not going to be completing this for all bycaught species. They've got enough on their plate trying to earn their living, let alone recording every bycaught species there is. And then finally, we have scientific surveys that occur on an annual basis. These are dedicated surveys for commercial fish stocks, so the likelihood of the overlap between diadromous fish, Atlantic salmon, and these commercial fish stocks are very low. So there's, again, very little data here. Now, each of the European and UK countries collect these 4 sources of data, and it feeds into one of the ICES working groups called ICES Bycatch. And they collect all this data, and they've got great models to analyse bycatch risk and assess and implement measures to protect these different species, which works really well on charismatic cetaceans, elasmobranchs, birds, turtles. Now, our little salmon and the European eel, although are threatened and protected species and legally meant to be under different legislations, they're not on the list. They're not on the list because there are specialised groups to calculate the stocks, but the ICES working group for North Atlantic salmon doesn't have this data to be able to analyse the risk of bycatch. So this slide is a slide that you might have seen from Simon Toms, thank you. Basically shows freely available data. It's from marine traffic, and basically each vessel has an AIS system where you can see where it moves. This occurs on all vessels. They can turn it off, but basically it's to ensure they don't really bump into each other. Now, what we see from this map is some fishing vessels, and you can see they're congregating all together in the period of time where our little smolts are migrating north. Now, these pelagic fishing vessels can reach up to 3 football pitches in length, their nets, let alone their depth, and catch some 250 tonnes of their target species, which might be mackerel or herring. So there's a few pictures there, but so basically it's a needle in a haystack. How are you going to spot a tiny smolt in these hundreds of tonnes of fish? So NASCO, the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organisation, tasked ICES Working Group for North Atlantic Salmon to put in place some research, which we did in 2023, to understand more about bycatch risks for pelagic and coastal fisheries. Basically, the conclusions were there's little monitoring, it's difficult to obtain information, and there's apparent under-monitoring. I will say that ICES working group also had a separate working group some 20 years ago, WK-SAL, and came up with the same sort of conclusions. There's a need for quantitative analysis on bycatch risks. There's a need to standardise bycatch monitoring programmes, not only between fishing types, but between countries, inshore and offshore. We need to include salmon on ICES working group for bycatch, or else have a working group so that we can assess the actual risk of the problem, improve onshore screening, and, as the children said yesterday, trial eDNA analysis, which still hasn't been undertaken. So, thanks to the Fishmongers company, they gave, or Colin Ball found it as well, some funding so that we could start to answer some of these questions. So Aislinn Borland, who's Colin's PhD student, basically started with a group of us undertaking some bycatch risk analysis on smolts. So through ICES, we did a data call from these different countries on these 7 different fisheries to understand landings data, pelagic fisheries landings data. As you can see, they're all silvery fish that can look much like the other. So these maps here show the landings data, aggregated landings data from these 7 different fisheries, from these different countries, split up across the smolting months as these fish migrate north, April to August. The yellow colours are high landings, the blue colours are low landings, and these black boxes around them show the sort of smolt migration, basically, as they slowly move forward, and the areas that we know that our smolts move within. The aim of this was to understand bycatch risks, categorize it according to high, medium, low, pretty simple. And these are the results. So for blue whiting, we decided the depth at which the fisheries work, which are generally below 150, 200 meters, doesn't coincide with the depth at which our smolts swim. However, some research on a different salmon, the Chinook salmon, has shown, and I've seen it in many other commercial fish species, with climate change, our fish are starting to swim to deeper depths, and there's going to be more likelihood of an overlap between them. Then we have herring and mackerel, which were identified as high risk. So I've given you the simplified results here, but we've looked at this in space and time and fishery, and also looked at cumulative effects. And just to point out, although this covers a much wider area than UK waters, these three fisheries are UK's topmost landed species, so it does affect us. Then you have horse mackerel and sardine, which were medium risk, and then chub mackerel and capelin, which were lower risk, which occurs more in the southerly countries, and there's less of a cumulative risk. With herring and mackerel, we really saw the fisheries were almost following the smolt migration. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to get data from two key nations, being the Faroese and Russia. Now, Aislinn tried to do some modelling to understand potentially how much data we were missing, and when we looked at the graphs, which I'm not going to show here, it's a little bit complicated, but it almost doubled. So the risk of these three fisheries could be a lot more. So we've got a slight understanding of the risk for smolts, but yet we have no idea on the bycatch risk from 1 to 3C winter adults. Moving on, inshore fisheries. So this map here is from Global Fishing Watch. It has amazing data sets, 1 meter resolution every hour on fishing activities in broad gear categories. It's heavy, it's brilliant. And this map here shows gill netting from 2012 to 2022, the mean fishing activity. The problem with this data set is it doesn't capture under 12 meter vessels well. This map here is vessel monitoring system data, not publicly accessible, almost impossible to get your hands on. I've been trying for quite a few years, but it shows just 1 year of gill netting data, under 10 meter vessels, fishing activities. So you can see, although the resolution isn't the same, there's a vast quantity of fishing that we're not able to see, not able to capture. Now, we've got various studies that exist showing that gill netting and pelagic fisheries is a problem, but the data's not there or accessible to understand it. Now, in the UK, or England, more to the point, sorry, there's bycatch gill netting legislation by law, stopping gill netting occurring between 3 to 5 meters, which is brilliant. However, we know that our fish swim to much deeper depths, so effectively making this bylaw ineffective, although it was a nice try. Now, we also have an incredible network of UK marine protected areas, the blue lines being special areas of conservation under the Habitats Directive. The red ones are national designated MPAs, and these three little yellow ones are no-take zones where no fishing is allowed. Now, most of these MPAs have been designated to protect features. Unfortunately, although salmon are a listed species with marine legislation to protect them, there is no wholly marine protected area to protect them, apparently because they're too mobile, but there are certain birds and cetaceans on the list, so not sure what went on there. Anyway, when I was working in France a few years ago, we undertook an analysis. We collected as much data we could on the presence of diadromous fish, here salmon, and then we overlaid these species distribution models with special areas of conservation, which are these black lines that have salmon listed to be protected. And the orange areas are where there was an overlap between the two, basically showing that our MPAs could be doing something to protect the species if we wanted them to, which they currently don't. Now, the French have acted upon this, and they are now implementing management measures to protect salmon within these MPAs. The other thing that we found is when the MPA is connected to the salmon's natal rivers, it does even more for it. It's not rocket science, but there you go. The other thing the French are doing that we tried to get funding for, that we didn't manage to, is they used VMS data at this fine scale resolution, so you can understand more specifically where the pressures are. They looked at individual gear categories and looked at the pressures and bycatch risk in space and time to different species, including salmon here, of bycatch within the MPAs, once again, so that they can implement targeted management measures to protect this fish. Again, we're not doing this. Now, a little bit about the Pacific side. You've heard about this. I'm definitely not a Pacific salmon specialist, so don't ask me any questions here. But basically, they started to see a decline. They started to see a correlation between the pollock fishery and the hake fishery and bycatch. And as a result of the CBD, which is international legislation, they started to enact monitoring at sea with a legal enforcement to do so. Here's a comparative table between what's going on in North America, Canada, and Alaska, and for the Chinook salmon and our Atlantic salmon on the Northeast Atlantic side. So basically, more than 50% of the hake fishery is subsampled, and 100% of all demersal fisheries. Us, on the other side of the ocean, approximately 2%. In the UK, it's less than that. And then of this subsampling, again, 100% of that haul is sifted through to make sure and understand whether there's any bycatch. And they are seeing a lot of bycatch. Ours is subsampled, and if that. Again, they've got a specific hake observer program to collect more dedicated data and understand more about it. There's nothing for pelagic or gill netting. They're collecting genetic samples to understand more about the migration of these species, understand which rivers they come from. Again, we've got nothing going on this side of the ocean. And they've been monitoring salmon bycatch only since 2008. We've been doing it since 2003. Yeah, we still don't know anything about it. And they have freely accessible, aggregated spatial and temporal fisheries landings data available. Again, we're struggling to get this. So what can we do? Well, first of all, salmon needs to be protected in their marine life cycle as well as in the freshwater. There's a lot done in their freshwater, not so much in the marine area. They need to be accounted for in management plans, including marine protected areas. We need to start avoiding gill netting around their natal estuaries. And we need to start collecting more data whilst they're at sea, both onshore when they're landed and through fisheries observer data. And we need to answer NASCO's request to understand more about pelagic inshore bycatch risk analysis to really start implementing targeted management measures rather than fumbling around in the dark, which was what we seem to be doing. And then, as I said, eDNA and genetic analysis, we can start to collect more samples. We can start to practice this out on scientific bottom trawl surveys or pelagic vessels, which we're not doing. Here is just a little bit of evidence from Dylan. He was on board some gill netting, and they are being caught. We're just turning a blind eye to it. Thank you very much, and any other comments?
Sophie, thank you very much indeed. And we're going to move on now to the interactions between inshore fisheries and wild salmon. And we have Hannah Rudd from the Angling Trust to speak. Hannah leads a marine policy and research at the Angling Trust. Her work focuses on domestic and international fisheries management. She's a member also of the European Anglers Alliance. Last month, she was shortlisted for the prestigious Ocean and Coastal Futures Bob Earl Award, which celebrates professionals under the age of 30 making a significant contribution to marine and coastal communities. She's the I don't know how she manages all of this, by the way. She's the co-founder of Shark Hub UK, and she's also the author of British Living Seas, Our Coastal Wildlife and How We Can Save It. Hannah.
Good morning, everyone. Before I dive into my presentation, it really is a pleasure to be here, and I just want to quickly take a moment to reflect on some of the conversations we've had at this event so far. Our natural world is falling away from us before our eyes. That's no secret at all. I'm often immersed in the world of sharks and other marine species like cod and pollock as opposed to salmon. But the common themes of decline are sadly universal, no matter what species or event you're attending. Whether that's through scientific research or the stories of people in coastal communities at the front line, the community I work with, the recreational sea angling community, speaking of more and bigger fish a mere 30 or 40 years ago. Yesterday, we experienced the enthusiasm of school children for discovering their local river. And I thought about that same joy and enthusiasm I had as a child of falling in love with the ocean, and I'm sure we all have very similar stories, and that's part of the reason why we are here today. And fast forward to today, I'm very much at the start of my career, but I feel deeply and passionately, more so than ever, that we really need to roll our sleeves and get cracking with some of the things that we're talking about and take some action. And I sincerely hope that when I'm at the end of my career, I'm not sat in perhaps this very same room or a room like this, looking at the children of tomorrow thinking, we didn't really do everything that we possibly could, and we're sat here at an extinction event rather than celebrating our success. So as I kind of turn my attention to this presentation, our ocean is at the center of the biodiversity and climate crisis. And in the words of Arthur C. Clarke, how inappropriate to call this planet Earth when it is quite clearly planet Ocean. In fact, many of us don't give the ocean a second thought, and yet we are intrinsically linked to its health. And while you're sitting here right now, statistically, every second breath that you're taking is produced by the ocean. And that's what I'd like us to focus on today through the lens of the Atlantic salmon, the ocean, and more specifically, the inshore coastal environment. And perhaps most importantly, while we aren't doing much in this space now to protect wild salmon at sea, there are definitely the policy levers and management mechanisms in place if we have the political will to do so, to safeguard wild salmon at sea. And you've heard from Sophie there on some of the science and the monitoring gaps that we have at present. So I'm very much going to give you a high-level overview in terms of where we are, but also how through the Fisheries Management Plan programme that we've got now here in the UK, there are opportunities to really fast-track some of this monitoring and protection of wild salmon at sea. So I'm not going to labour this point. We've already heard lots of conversations over the last day or so about the declining state of salmon in the marine environment and reasons reasons that could be driving that. And as Sophie so eloquently put, we need better monitoring, we need recognition of salmonids as marine species, and we need stronger precautionary management. We are really in a place now where we shouldn't be waiting for more data in order to actually take some action. I do worry, I don't know about anyone else, but that we might wake up one day and have all the data in the world, but salmon are gone, and we don't have anything to do. Oh, sorry, we can't do anything more about it. So I'm not going to labour this either. Sophie's very eloquently spoken about gillnet fisheries and what they are, but just in case you aren't familiar with them, here's some diagrams for you. So they can either be boat-based fisheries or they can be deployed from the shore, fixed nets or drift nets, but this is generally what we're speaking about for those of you that aren't familiar with gillnets. But turning my attention very quickly, just as some kind of background in case anyone wasn't aware, we have left the European Union and become an independent coastal state here in the UK. And with that comes opportunities, but there also comes challenges. So when we left the Common Fisheries Policy, the UK government developed a programme called the UK Fisheries Management Plan programme that are currently being developed at the moment. And this is designed to initiate world-class fisheries management here in the UK. And I'm just going to walk you through some examples where salmonids are already being considered within the Fisheries Management Plan programme, but where it could also go further to protect salmonids at sea. So within the Joint Fisheries Statement, which is accompanying to the Fisheries Act, which is effectively our replacement for the Common Fisheries Policy, there are a number of different objectives, and some of them I've just pulled out here that are directly relatable to what we're talking about in relation to salmonids. So I particularly like this one. Demands for additional evidence are not used to avoid or delay taking difficult management decisions. We then have the ecosystem objective, where it specifically mentions incidental catches of sensitive species are minimised and where possible eliminated. We then also have the scientific objective, where we take an evidence-based approach and make full use of the best available scientific advice to support decision making. So that all sounds fantastic, but where do you actually begin to implement that? So the first tranche of fisheries management plans has been published after a long co-development and consultation process, and it was somewhat heartening to see that there are actions within the bass fisheries management plan that relate to sensitive species bycatch and monitoring, particularly with a focus on salmonids. So determining whether we need regional or national protections to prevent migratory fish bycatch, whether we need to look at gear incentives for switching from gillnet fisheries to hook and line, which obviously have a much lower risk of bycatch, and also improving that really important monitoring that Sophie was mentioning previously. But it doesn't really end there. There are over 40 fisheries management plans, and I think it's really important that we think about that ecosystem-based approach as much as we possibly can when we're looking at fisheries management plans. So particularly some of the pelagic fisheries that were alluded to in the previous presentation, there are lots of opportunities here to really capitalise on when it comes to safeguarding salmon at sea and improving that monitoring effort that's being undertaken. But there's also a question of whether the UK government should implement a fisheries management plan for diadromous fish at sea. I don't know about anyone else, but I find it quite irritating when you're talking about salmon at sea. Who do I speak to? The MMO don't want to speak to you. The Environment Agency don't want to speak to you. The IFCAs don't want to speak to you. Where do we go in terms of looking at salmon at sea and management? So I think we really need quite a clear-cut message in relation to that. Again, Sophie mentioned marine protected areas, or marine unprotected areas, as I like to call them. But I think it would be remiss of me to not really hammer those points home in terms of the opportunities there for marine protected areas. Perhaps they should ban all damaging and destructive fishing as a default. You know, maybe we should look beyond bottom trawling and we should look at things like gill netting as well. Maybe we should have marine protected areas for fish as opposed to just the features. I mean, what a crazy idea, hey? And we should also look at the connectivity between the different MPAs in terms of particularly protecting migratory and highly mobile species. So in terms of the 4 steps or the 4 takeaways I'd like you to really think about in terms of protecting wild salmon at sea is firstly that recognition of diadromous fish as marine species. It's a key part of their life stage. It seems crazy that they're not formally recognised in that way. Really embedding measures to monitor and reduce salmonid bycatch within the UK Fisheries Management Plan programme. That seems like such a simple standard thing that we should be looking at. Banning gillnet fisheries, dare I say it, within the UK's Marine Protected Area Network, and investing in data collection to really support these monitoring efforts to understand wild salmon at sea, including bycatch risk and tracking. You can have the best catchment-based approaches in the rivers that you want, but if we don't start resolving these issues at sea, then salmon may possibly never recover in the numbers we need them to. And the last point I really would just like to raise is that the gillnet issue is not confined to salmon. We know that gillnet fisheries can have huge volumes of bycatch of a whole range of sensitive species. Just some figures to throw at you here. Around 400,000 seabirds are thought to be caught in gillnets as bycatch each year. 20 million pelagic sharks globally are thought to be caught in bycatch gillnet fisheries, also longlines, and around 300,000 cetaceans as well. So just by taking that action, you won't only be protecting the salmon, but you'll be protecting a lot of other species that are really important when we're adopting that ecosystem-based approach. So I'll leave you with this question of should we ban the use of gillnets inshore? I'd be interested to hear what some of your views are on that over the next day or so. And thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you very much. So what of the international legal duties in relation to bycatch? Well, Dr. Tom Appleby is an associate professor at the University of England, and chief legal affairs at the Blue Marine Foundation, and he's worked in marine conservation and fisheries for 25 years. He's going to speak on this now. Thank you, Tom.
I'm a lawyer, I'm afraid, so just a few disclaimers. Penny Game was meant to be giving this presentation, and so I was drafted in at the last minute, so this is an outsider's look on the legislation involved rather than an insider's. But I think I've got enough sense in this to give you a drive-by of what's going on and some of the recommendations for the future. So I'm going to start off with a question. Where does this, to open it up to the audience, where does this come from? This is, which one? Magna Carta. Well done, congratulations. In the Magna Carta of 1215 actually has fisheries protection legislation tucked away in it. And you do have to ask yourself, when they were looking at the data 810 years ago, you know, how did they go about collecting their data then? We've been at this just a long time, much longer than we think. I've got here, this is Stewart's Treatise on the Laws of Fisheries of Scotland from 1870. There is 120 pages in here of just salmon regulations, as well as some sea fishery stuff, and that's before you get to the 100 pages of common law on salmon rights as well. We've been at regulation of this for a long time. So I'm going to trot through some of the regulations that are important here. The first is the Berne Convention, which was signed back in 1979, and that has requirements in there for appropriate legislative measures which involve data collection. And this is the forerunner of the Habitats Directive. It also is quite interesting because it has some quite toothy powers collected in there if states, and the UK is one of them, the signatory states via the Council of Europe, if states don't comply with it. So there's a complaints mechanism. I looked through the complaints mechanism to see if anyone had complained about salmon in UK waters, and we haven't. Maybe a hint, somebody there? The Convention on the Protection of the Marine Environment of the North Atlantic OSPAR. Now this is quite interesting because whereas the last one was from the Council of Europe, this one is about marine pollution. But like a lot of legislation, you sort of start off in one direction and it travels into other directions. And now it has obligations in it. The parties shall undertake at regular intervals assessments of the quality status of the marine environment, including an evaluation of the measures taken and planned. And they do measures for salmon. Interesting. What you'll see there, the salmon 2022 assessment, all red. So something's going wrong there. But I think it's quite, what you're seeing here as well is a general pattern of legislation coming from different bases. NASCO. NASCO is another one, the Convention on the Conservation of Salmon in the North Atlantic Ocean. Comes from Article 66 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is quite an important piece of regulation because it gives it's the enabling piece of legislation which sets out why people are able to fish in the seas in the first place. So you have to think that when we fish on the high seas, and even when we fish within our EEZs, we have limited sovereignty. We're not given full rights. It's not outside the 12 nautical mile limit. We only have certain rights in it, and those rights contain obligations. And part of those obligations is complying with the data collection and the management requirements that you get from being a signatory to NASCO. And NASCO have done Sophie will know more, but NASCO have done a good fist at trying to comply with their obligations. They've contracted ICs to do stock assessments and do reports on salmon, and that system seems to be working. But of course, you have to remember it's coming from a slightly different place than the other bits of regulation. And then, of course, taking a step down. Now, I know the UK has left the European Union, but the EU Habitats Directive still effectively applies in the UK, and of course it applies across European waters. And what I didn't mention about the Berne Convention, and this is really weird, only lawyers could do this, we have designated salmon as protected only in as far as it doesn't go into the sea. So you've got a crazy situation that the thing is protected for only part of its life cycle. Now, that is clearly bonkers, and it's actually not quite legally true either, because the sites that are protected for salmon, and there are quite a few, as a species, if you're doing something outside of that river that is an SAC, a special area of protection, so specially protected habitat, if it's going to then impact on the salmon fishery, either when the smolts are departing or when the mature salmon are arriving back, then you should be doing some sort of appropriate assessment if it's a licensed activity, or the state should be controlling it. So actually, salmon rivers do have marine protections if you think an activity is going to impact on your river. So that's maybe one thing to think about as well. The other thing, I know this was touched on yesterday, is Hinkley Point Nuclear Power Station. So I never really thought of a power station being a fish-killing device before, but basically it is an enormous bycatch engine. 182 million fish, according to Professor Peter Henderson from Oxford University, are going to get killed in the water cooling system as it goes through. And that, I don't think, counts the crustaceans, which are the base of the food web for the Severn Estuary, which, of course, is a huge nursery area, but not just for salmon, but for the whole ecosystem. So I'm not particularly pleased with the EDF or the Prime Minister for calling the impacts small. They're going to be massive, and we're going to have to plan for that, which is fine, but I just wish EDF would talk to us rather than badger the Prime Minister. So that Habitats Directive does have. Now, all of this is very disparate legislation, and there is some good news in all this, and that is that the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, European legislation, but transferred into British legislation, does try and pull in all of those disparate bits of regulation that we have. You know, there's a lot more than I have got into, but it pulls it all into one pot and starts talking about good. What is good and what is bad? I don't like defining what good is. I can define what bad is. So that is quite helpful for us, and there are various bits and pieces of working group. There are working groups that are being established. So the working group on bycatch of protected species, for instance, is operating under the MSFD inside Europe. And that means they're trying to collate everything. And there is another piece which I think is really underplayed, which I think came out yesterday more than it just, that came out yesterday, is that salmon has this socioeconomic element to it. It's an iconic species and it's an economic species. And when you're trying to protect the environment because it's there, it's much harder. I'm looking at JL in the audience. We've worked really, really hard to try and get these things across. It's really difficult. But where you've got an economic case, it's easier. And I think we should be badging the economics and the science together and maybe using the MSFD as a process of pulling all that together to push the agenda for salmon higher up than it is. One other little note on that is that the UK has tried to put protections in for sand eels under the MSFD, and it's being tried today in The Hague. The EU have objected. We put in, Blue Marine put in an amicus brief, so we've put in our own legal pleadings, if you like, into the occasion. My colleague is actually sitting in the audience there at the moment, and we're all wishing her well. But it was, we really did. We chucked, well, Professor Catherine Barnard, who's probably the leading European law expert in the world, drafted our pleadings for us. So we're quite comfortable that we've done the best we possibly can. But there is a real danger with this, and actually with the common fisheries policy, that we get some good science, we get our good data, and then the whole thing trots off to the fisheries management, and the fisheries management in DG Mare, under the common fisheries policy, are used to managing commercial fisheries. That's what they do, day in, day out. They know everybody. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's just human nature. They're used to dealing with the commercial fisheries. So any new kid on the block, which includes the environment groups, and to some extent includes salmon groups, they're not used to establishing liaisons with them. So DG Mare are hugely important in this, because they will be trying to enact the final legislation for bycatch measures or whatever it is, will go under the common fisheries policy in European waters, and very possibly in the UK, similarly, we'll be doing through fisheries management measures. So we have to speak into that space. And then there's another list of stuff. The Water Framework Directive, for instance, applies, they're looking at good ecological status rather than good environmental status, less focus on economics. That applies to 3 nautical miles out in Scotland, which is interesting, and 1 nautical mile around the rest of Europe. But we've also, the EU didn't just stop there. We've got the Marine Spatial Planning Directive, the Strategic Environmental Impact Assessment, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement with the EU has got a non-regression clause that we won't actually fall back on our environmental measures, which is, I tried to get the UK to counterclaim against the EU, but they didn't. And the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and I haven't even mentioned the Convention on Biological Diversity and various others. So there's a whole list of environment legislation. There is another thing. European Convention on Human Rights. Salmon fishing is very unusual, particularly in Scotland, in that it is a private right. So outside 3 nautical miles, I think it belongs to the Crown, but out to the 3-mile limit, probably, it belongs via some ancient baronial titles to riparian owners. Now, if you have a property right that is being interfered with, then you have a potential to sue to protect that property right. Now, good old Stuart, there was a lot of case law on this from the 19th century. Good old Stuart says you can't affect injuriously the senior fishing right, which is the salmon fishing right. So if you're doing something that interferes with the salmon fishing rights in inshore waters in Scotland, you possibly have an argument to start having a look and collecting more data to use those type of arguments. And that is worked out by the courts through a nuisance action on the balance of probabilities. I just had a lovely paper with Sir Crispin Agnew on that. So conclusions. What you have here is messy, overlapping maze of, I think, a wobbly wedding cake, that's what I called it, of different laws all going together. You have the potential of some quite good binding legislation like the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. Are countries fulfilling their requirements? These are the 4 questions I was asked. Well, no. We have huge gaps in the data. I think sometimes one of the wonderful things on Hinkley Point when they were collecting the data is they said, look, we've got this data set from somewhere else where we had an input and there were no salmon caught there in one of the other power stations. It just so happens I know someone who worked at the other power stations and that he told me the reason there's no salmon on the data set is because every time a salmon came in, well, he said, well, we ate it. So you have to be quite careful on using other data sets. But there are huge gaps in the data, and I think I'm particularly excited about the advances of tagging. I think the opportunities we've got now to tag smolts and get data that way, we're going to get some really interesting knowledge coming in. Also, remember there are various complaint mechanisms. Inside the European Union, you can complain to the Commission. There are complaints mechanisms under the Berne Convention. There are all sorts of goodness tucked away in these bits of regulation we perhaps need to exploit a bit better. Are salmon a marine species? That was another question I was asked. Like I said, only lawyers could come up with the absurd suggestion that they're not a marine species as well as an aquatic species. So what do you want from the law and the data? That's the question you've got to ask. It's not what you can do for the law, it's what the law can do for you. We have enough legislation. We just need to apply it, and we just need to be much smarter in pulling it all together. If not, we'll end up like King John, the worst king of England, who let salmon collapse on his watch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. I feel like your wobbly wedding cake could stimulate a huge discussion. Unfortunately, we don't have time, but it would be very interesting to carry that on. We're going to enter the aquaculture session now, but before that, we're going to have a few minutes of a film. Ted Hughes' 1983 poem, That Morning, from his collection River, has inspired the title of this short film by artist, activist, and actor Jim Murray, called Creatures of Light.
The wild Atlantic salmon is in grave danger of becoming extinct within our lifetime, and it's an incredibly important fish. It's a keystone species that we can learn a lot from. We've lost 75% of the numbers in as many years. So Creatures of Light, fundamentally speaking, is art to save the salmon and the rivers that they dwell in. So we stood, alive in the river of light, among the creatures of light, creatures of light. When I read those lines, creatures of light, that's from a Ted Hughes poem called That Morning. And that just sums up my feelings for salmon, this mythical, beautiful, desperately romantic creature.
Gonna see the riverman, gonna tell him all I can.
I picked around 10 key salmon rivers around the UK. I took the canvases, I pre-dyed them with organic dyes, cleaned them up, and then sunk them. The canvases have been placed in spawning grounds where the salmon lay eggs for 2 months, tethered them to the riverbed or to a tree or to a rock or weighted them down. I want these canvases to absorb the river and represent the next generation of salmon. All sorts happened over the winter, storms, floods, whatever. It tore some of them to bits. I lost a few of them. But the ones that survived, as in the strong salmon, the strong canvases, I pulled them out, I dried them off, and then whatever came back to me, I had no plans. I just started painting with inks and acrylic paint and powder paint, and the result was what you see today. And I've cut them up into 6 squares to represent a shoal, and I want people to tell their friends and people to inquire about, what's that on your wall? What is that? That's an odd painting. Oh, that was sunk in the River Wye for 2 months. What the hell was that about? The life cycle of the Atlantic salmon, of course, is very wrapped up in this exhibition. Salmon spawn in freshwater rivers, and then they live in the river for a couple of years, and then they go out to sea.
They come and go.
Obviously, salmon need cold, clean water, and if the rivers aren't clean, the salmon won't be coming back. I picked the Devon up in Aberdeen, Royal Dee, the Spey, the Tay, a couple of rivers in the Outer Hebrides, the Fjordbruck being one of them, which is Gaelic for hope because the Outer Hebrides is the last bastion for the wild Atlantic salmon. And then I came down into England and I picked the Wye, border between England and Wales, because that river is in a desperate state. Pollution from predominantly agriculture, but the usual suspects, the water companies, and the salmon stock are hanging by a thread. Then I came down to the chalk streams, the Itchen and the Test in Hampshire. Both rivers, the salmon head is also in desperate need. Luckily, I'm blessed with having good relations with gillies, river keepers, people that work for NGOs, people that work on rivers in general. This couldn't have happened without the help of a lot of people. Every time I'm in a salmon river, wherever it is in the world, I am happy and I feel obliged to protect these animals. What I implore people to do is learn about this fish, this wonderful, important, and very rare fish. Atlantic salmon are symbolic of a healthy river system, a healthy ocean. If we can save them, then we're saving our water.
Beautiful stuff, thank you. We're now going to talk about pressures on our coastal waters. Aquaculture is the fastest growing sector in global food production, with an annual growth rate of 8%. Norway, of course, is the global leader, producing 53% of the world's salmon, exporting every year 1.2 million tonnes, and Scotland is also up there. But of course, we know that researchers have long highlighted the environmental cost of this and the impact on wild salmon. So are there alternatives? What are they? And what is the industry planning in Scotland? And what about closed containment operations? That is what we're going to talk about now for the next session until lunchtime. It is an emotive and extremely urgent issue, and emotions do run high, but in the words of Jane Goodall, change happens by listening. and then starting a dialogue with the people who are doing something you don't believe is right. And so it is in that spirit of listening that we'll enter this, this session now. Robust debate, but polite and dignified debate is important. So I'm delighted to introduce Paul Mugaas from the Norwegian Salmon Rivers Organisation, an NGO. He's the head of communications there. They represent management teams in 122 salmon-bearing watercourses, and they work to preserve the stocks of wild salmon, sea trout and sea char. They represent about 10,000 fishing rights holders, accounting for about 70% of all licenses of salmon rivers in Norway. Paul.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here, even though the situation is kind of bleak. We were founded in 1992 as a volunteer organization for the river owners in Norway. And in 2013, there was a change in the law, which made it all the river owners of a certain river have to get organized in the same organization, the River Management Organization. And it's these river management organizations that we represent. So it's more than 10,000 individual river owners, and at the moment 128 rivers, as you can see, spread out over most of Norway. The good thing about Norway is that we have very, very good scientists. We have this Norwegian Scientific Advisory Committee, which each year publishes a report and gives advice to the government on how to manage the wild salmon. And it's important that this committee is an independent body. And the status, well, as you might have heard earlier on today, the minister, he mentioned some numbers. We only caught about 45,000 salmon in the Norwegian rivers this summer. And also 20,000 salmon of mixed stock was caught in the sea. This is, of course, partly because 33 of our iconic rivers were closed this summer because there was no big or medium-sized salmon coming back to the rivers. This is the development of the river catches in Norway. I started to work in Norwegian salmon rivers in 2014, and we published the first report about river catches in 2015. And as you can see maybe on the number, it's 133,000 salmon were caught that year. And we thought that was an average, not very good, but an average year. The recent development, well, now we're down to 45,000 salmon, and we had the lowest before that in 2023, and 2021 was also a very bad year. So the development is nothing to brag about. And this is where the scientists come in. They have internationally published this kind of way to look at the problems for the wild salmon. On the axis here, you have the effect of the problem, and on this axis, you have the timeline. So if you're here, it's okay. If you're there, it's not so okay. And it's a very expanding threat for the wild salmon. So we can put in the different problems facing the wild salmon. Might be a bit difficult to read from behind. But it's, as you can see, the Gyrodactylus salaris, which has infected like 50 Norwegian rivers earlier on and been a problem for almost 50 years. It's now almost terminated. It has infected or afflicted a lot of rivers, but it's not a further chance of negative development. These three factors, escaped farm salmon, salmon lice, and other infectious diseases from salmon farming, are very dangerous for the wild salmon at the moment. And we also have climate change coming up as a factor, amplifying these other problems. So 3 of the 4 most important threats against the wild salmon is caused by the farming of salmon in Norway. I also include the similar chart for the sea trout. As you can see, the sea lice is a very big problem for the sea trout as well, but there are some other factors also inflicting, for instance, agriculture and so on. We have a quality norm for the wild stocks in Norway. Each river has at least one stock. I think Tana River in the north have like 33 different stocks in the river. And each river shall have at least a green figure. If you can see the map, it's not very many green rivers. They're mostly red, yellow, and orange. And there are 2 factors in this quality norm. It's the harvestable surplus of salmon, which states that it should be at least 80% of the normal harvestable surplus. And it should also be genetic integrity of the salmon in the river. And when we're talking about genetic integrity, it's only measured if it's affected by escaped farmed salmon. And when you look at this chart, it might not be so difficult to see that this is causing problems. You see the enormous amount of salmon farming in Norway, and it really took off like in the 90s and has expanded further on and further on. And there is also a big mortality in the farming industry in Norway. 16.7% in 2023, which equals 65 million dead salmons in the pens. And this is an enormous waste of food resources. I mean, you use like 2.5 kilo of fodder to produce 1 kilo of farmed salmon, and you have the average weight of this dead salmon being 2.2 kilo. It's almost 340,000 tons of food waste. So that's also a big problem. And salmon lice is the situation with salmon lice is being worse every year to come. We have this situation in the north of Norway. It was the worst sea lice August ever recorded. And this is all because of the warming seawater, which is warmer because of the climate change. And if you know something about the biology of the salmon lice, it's if it goes 2 degrees warmer seawater, the salmon lice explodes. It really takes off. So it's not so strange that you see these horrendous pictures with all the sea lices. This is farmed salmon. This is a wild salmon. I caught this one myself outside Trondheim in the area called Fosen this year. You can see all the lice on the salmon, and this is actually called a lice crown. I never seen this on a wild salmon before. It's quite common on the farmed salmon, and it must be a hell of a situation for the wild salmon, because you can't scratch yourself when you're a salmon, and you probably die before you get to spawn. The minister mentioned the Norwegian traffic light system. Just do a short summary of that. We have, if you go below 10% mortality from sea lice on the wild salmon going out in the fjords, the farmers are allowed to buy 6% of growth every second year. If you have between 10 and 30% mortality, you have to freeze the level of production. And if it's more than 30% mortality, you have to downscale by 6% every second year. And this map shows the current situation at the moment. And it's, I think it's time for, this is being evaluated every second year. And it affects the rivers. As you can see, that's the production area, the status. And you can see the mortality from very famous rivers like 32%, 24% and 49%, which means that almost half of the wild salmon coming from the river, passing through the farms areas, dies before it even goes out to the open sea. And as we know, the situation in the open sea at the moment is changing rapidly. So there is no wonder there isn't coming very many salmon back to Norway. And this is the future. You can see this one. This is the current the steering group for the assessment of sea lice impact. Published this one 1 or 2 months ago. And now we have green just in production area 1, where there is almost no production of farm salmon. And up here in Finnmark, where we have just a little bit of farm salmon. The rest of the coast is yellow, so it's a freeze situation. And we still have a red area on the west coast, which we have the biggest concentration of salmon farms. So, okay, this is the future. The coast is yellow, the wild salmon is going to perish, and the aquaculture is not going to have any growth possibility. So it's a stalemate, both for the wild salmon and for the aquaculture. So how do we solve this? We started to think about this a few years ago. And we came up with a solution, which we then discussed with the aquaculture farmers. This guy here is Robert Eriksson. He's CEO of one of the... There are 2 big organizations in Norway representing the salmon farmers. He is the CEO of one of them. And together we went to the then Minister of Fisheries, Bjørnar Skjæran, to present our solution. And it could be there are other solutions, but we think this is a very good solution. And the whole thing is we want the open net pens out of the sea. If we continue with open net farming in the sea, the wild salmon and the sea trout are going to disappear in Norway. There's no question about it. At the same time, the aquaculture wants, of course, to expand their business, to grow. Every business wants to grow. So we have to come up with a solution that benefits both parties. And one of the solutions we were thinking about was if the fish farmers can expand, exchange their permits. You have 1 permit or 1 license for producing in open net pens. Maybe you can have 2 if you change to closed containment. And we also heard Bjørnar Eriksson. He was talking about, is this closed containment? Is this the solution? And he was a bit vague on that, because they always think, we don't want to impose technology. We don't want to say you must use this technology or that technology. It's the government's supposed to be technology neutral. We're not saying you should use this or that technology. We're saying you have to close the bucket. How you build the bucket As long as it's watertight, we don't care. So it's just a functional demand. But if the fish farmers change, we will get the technological revolution. There are already some farmers producing in closed containment. Sondre Eide is going to talk about that later on, I think. And we see more and more of the technological companies along the coast of Norway are looking to the possibility to produce this. And if you want to buy a license or a permit in Norway, it's about 21 million euros. So if the government says, okay, you take one out, you can have two back. You have 21 million euros you can use for technological development. That would kickstart the development of closed containment. And we think it's the only way forward for the aquaculture in the yellow and the red areas, because they have to take down their production as it is of today, or they can't grow anyway. So it's also important to notice for the farmers that the market is changing. More and more consumers want to have sustainably produced salmon in the future. And there's if you look at the score for the farming industry in Norway, they get 29 out of 100 points. They're not people don't trust them. Don't trust they're doing the best to save the wild salmon and producing the best product they can produce. So they have to do something to change what people think about them, and they have to produce for a new and emerging market. So we worked with this for a while, and there was a group working on a new framework for the law, as Bjørn Eriksen was telling you. There is a white paper coming up in April with the suggestion for the new aquaculture law in Norway. But before this, there was a joint industrial committee in the Norwegian Parliament asking the government to imply this exchange policy to start this production of closed containment. And the government delivered, Bjørn Eriksen's government delivered, but not sufficient. Nobody was very happy with what he delivered, or the Minister of Fisheries delivered on just before Christmas. But it's still a few months to April, and we know there are people working very well with this new white paper, and it's going to be a very interesting period forward. But we think that this is the only way forward to save both the Atlantic salmon in Norway, save the sea trout, and make a sustainable future for the aquaculture. So we have mobilized at the moment 19 Norwegian NGOs. You might know the names of some of them. Naturvernforbundet, it's the Friends of the Earth Norway, and you see the WWF here. And these organizations together represent at least 500,000 people in Norway. And we're all demanding that you should change, you should close the pens. You have zero lice emission in salmon farming. That's the only way forward to save the Norwegian salmon. So that's it. I'll hope you support the action we're having in Norway. Thank you.
Paul, thank you very much, and Paul will be joining us shortly for a discussion. Next up is Anne Anderson from Scottish Sea Farms. Anne is the Head of Sustainability and Development there. They are, of course, the leading salmon grower in Scotland. She was formerly Sustainability Director for the Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation, now Salmon Scotland, and before that she spent 3 decades in the public sector with the regulator Scottish Environment Protection Agency, culminating in being Chief Officer of Compliance and Beyond. Anne.
Thank you. Good morning, or is it good afternoon? I'm not quite sure, I don't have my watch on. Thank you for including a section and allowing me to speak to you today. I very much believe that without being present to listen and to learn, we can't move forward. And that's very much what I'm going to be touching on as we go forth. I've also been very much sitting in the audience with the thoughts of the last 30 years of environmental protection and public health work that I've done. And it's been interesting to hear snippets and recollect and take me back into those periods of time. When I left SEPA in 1918, God. Whoa, that says something about how aged I'm feeling today. When I left in 2018 to move to the salmon sector, it was very much with a view of what could I do to drive a different change, a different process, and increase understanding and support. So with that in mind, I'm going to take you through the work that we've done to date, and I hope the technology lasts for me. I do also, should say, I'm a bit of a jinx when it comes to this sort of stuff. So, salmon farming, the picture that you have on the screens at the moment is a shot taken from a subsea pen within the Norwegian area south of Trondheim. I'm going to come back and touch on that later. Wee bit briefly about Scottish sea farms themselves. So I'm going to use this as a wee bit of a map in terms of the sector. So on the west coast of Scotland, we have our origins in around the south point of the map there in Oban, and our mainland region extends, drifts as you can see as we go north with fewer farms. The growth area for us as we go forward is the Northern Isles, particularly Shetland and Orkney. We feature there too. Now currently, I think when I think about salmon farming globally, I also think about the differences both in a geographical context, but also in the regulatory and the controls and decisions that have been made by different governments. And we heard yesterday from Carol from Marine Directorate on that reflection on, and that's exactly what I want to talk about, the reflection on the presumption against salmon farming in the north and east coasts, which was brought in decades ago. It was brought in not long after the introduction, as we heard in relation to the Tyne project of the Control of Pollution Act 74, or as I call it, COPA 74. And COPA 74 brought in a very strong precautionary principle into Scottish regulation of our waters and, for that matter, of the land-based activities. And that precautionary principle is actually very much at the heart of the way that the sector has developed over the years, and therefore how it actually operates within its landscape. So strong pollution prevention legislation, control, working in balance with nature has been a really common theme right the way through, and indeed was almost ahead of the EU Water Framework Directive that Tom referred to earlier. And when that came in around the 2005, the same precautionary principles, the same environmental controls to ensure that the pollution levels arising from those farms from the early 70s right the way through to where we currently operate are such that the farming themselves is, when you look at the data, the very definition of the Brundtland's Commission Sustainable Development. And that's in relation to, and I'm going to start to talk about wild salmon. It is, after all, Wild Salmon Connections Conference. But I think one of the key things is ensuring that the environment that you're inhabiting is as best as it can be. The salmon, whether they're farmed or wild salmon, or demand it. And therefore, stewardship of those places is absolutely the heart of the approach that we're taking in Scottish sea farms. And I see that mirrored in other companies across the salmon sector. So my focus is going to be a wee bit touching on, quite clearly, our farming strategy and how that links to and complements the actions that we are taking to manage the pressures that we pose to the wild salmon in Scotland. And it is also reflective of practices that you see across the wider sector within Scotland itself. So, shortly after leaving SEPA, I did very long, many hours and days spent with Alan Wells in various cafes in and around Edinburgh and up towards the Highlands, having a very clear discussion around what would a Salmon Interactions Working Group report actually jointly deliver and recommend to government. And from that, one of those key steps was the introduction that we heard from the Minister earlier of the SEPA's Sea Lice Risk Framework. Along with that was also a sector-led suggestion taking on some of the best practice that we've seen globally in respect to how Norway deals with escapes, and more specifically how you fund the conservation to actually then take the measures to overcome the escapes. Because currently under the Scottish regulation, every single fine goes straight into the exchequer. Fat chance of it finding its way anywhere into salmon conservation. And that's just the rules regardless of which particular regulator is issuing the fines. So how could you approach a sanctioning that provides an added investment into tackling the issue that you're being sanctioned for? And that clearly is a recommendation that we're still seeking to generate to see come forward. We've obviously got the Sea Lice Risk Framework in place. And from that framework, it identified 19 sites of a high relative risk. Bearing in mind precautionary principle firmly applied, and the Sea Lice Risk Framework is no different from the decades approach by Scottish Government and its delivery partners. The model is based on a 4 to 5 degree of caution. Very clear that we must ensure that we understand, and therefore the 19 sites of high risk have been set a very specific lice load limit. And then there are another 40 sites that have been identified as needing to hold to their current practice. And again, those lice loads limits are now being set. And I think it's really important to put a wee bit of reflection into the context about what we're speaking about. As an ex-environmental regulator, it came as quite some surprise to me to hear Jason talk about the inactivity in respect to water quantity and engineering work and how that has such a key impact as it goes forward. Sometimes you focus too narrow, and going wider clearly to learn lessons across the world is really, really key. And that's what I'm hoping to do today, and obviously clearly have discussions with yourself, a wee bit of explanation of what we're doing. I did say jinxed it, haven't I? I did say technology. I am pressing the green button. There we are. So very briefly, we have to remember salmon farming is a food production sector. If you accept the principle that farming livestock is something that you're content with, then salmon farming, when you look at sustainability measures, comes out on top across the main bands here. But you need to go further than obviously the facts and figures that this slide particularly shows. Must be the way I'm pressing the button. We are a growing species on planet Earth. The blue circle, as we heard from Louis yesterday, we are an ocean planet. And therefore, the amount of land that we have available, particularly within Scotland, to be able to farm is very constrained. This particular representation here, the blue, identifies the area that is used for agriculture to undertake their actions. And for those with the sharper eyes, will spot a pink island, partial island of Colonsay down at the bottom. That covers the area of the seabed that salmon farming utilise in the same way as agriculture does in terms of its organic loads. And that's actually one of those key points, the reflective point around that control in the size, scale and growth of the sector over the decades. So we need to find better ways to grow our food. We need to find more sustainable ways to do that. And there is an opportunity in the oceans, but if we ensure that we don't take the errors from the past forward with us into the future. Is the battery running out? So really important is understanding the places. So before you can actually even consider placing a farm, and I've got a slide here on the Sound of Mull. Sound of Mull is a marine protected area for a variety of species. And this particular shot shows the range of habitat types. The short video that hopefully will pop up in a minute is the example of a seabed survey that was undertaken. This visual survey identified a burrowing mud habitat 100 metres to the south of a farm that's been present there for over 30 years. That farm obviously regularly complies with its environmental quality standard, and that is the case in the majority of our farms. Our seabed standard currently within Scotland is 98% compliance, and I do know what went wrong with the few sites that have failed it, and I also know that the recovery of those sites occurred before we went back into farm, and how we then shape the future is very much reliant on the volume of environmental information that we bring to bear. My apologies that it's not kind of moving on. But in essence, as you can see from the picture, it doesn't actually much change from that kind of grey sludge that you're looking at. There is no aquaculture material that's been deposited on that site, because this was very much about understanding the biodiversity and therefore the measures we can take to add value, so that nature positive point when we come to develop sites. But that rather boring picture, as one of my colleagues stated to me, actually had 106 species within it, and it had 5 priority marine features. When we submitted the information to SEPA, who are going to work with us on a wider project of understanding depositional impacts within the Sound of Mull, immense ecological diversity was their view of the habitat that we are coexisting with. And that's really key to the progress and development into the future for our sites. So you can sort of see, and I'll briefly jump on, conscious of time. But when we come to look at farming, as with any livestock producer, we're looking at fish welfare, health and environmental impact. And very key to that in that assessment is understanding the space. So here and now, what have we got? This is a picture of a sister farm to the picture you saw earlier in the Sound of Mull, reducing down the number of pens, and that enables us to do far faster treatments. And when I speak about treatments nowadays within the Scottish sector are predominantly being done by freshwater for the purposes of gill health. It has a beneficial impact clearly in sea lice management, but sea lice management and sea lice levels are continuing their trend of downwards, with last year being the lowest again in terms of levels across the country. In terms of our farming strategy, investing in every single aspect of our business, we have broodstock and incubations, setups designed to ensure that the healthiest smoke possible, the largest smoke possible, goes out into the area of challenge, which is the marine. We're currently got planning permission for a land-based post-smolt, and we're currently assessing semi-containment as the next step to go forward. But the purpose of that is to ensure that we're reducing our time at sea. And so that's what I'm going to explain to you about, is the different ways in which we can farm. Reduction of time at sea, reduction of that environmental impact, and reduction of the sea lice load. So, semi-containment, what's that mean? Was a question that I was asked by Fishery Management Scotland last year to explain. In essence, it's about wrapping around a farm pen, a very solid barrier, drawing water from depth, and then it allows you the ability to have from a logistical perspective, to then collect the organics that come forward. But it forms a barrier between what is coming into the farms and, of course, a barrier from what then goes out from the farms. And this particular aspect is not yet in Scottish waters, but it is coming soon. The other areas we're looking at is where we have depth beyond the 100 metre, is to start to look at subsea pens. So lowering the entirety of an open pen 25 metres below the surface in the locations where that will add value to that environment and minimise our impacts and interactions with wild salmon. And then lastly, looking at ocean farm. Again, Feeding fish at 12-metre depth is the way that these farms operate. How are they placed? How are they connecting? And understanding those spaces to ensure that we're not sitting on top of a wild salmon migration path, which is why the sector has been working with the Missing Atlantic Salmon Trust and other partners in understanding migration paths within the aquaculture zone in Scotland. But what does this all mean? So this graph shows you a typical sea lice journey. The longer the farm fish are in the sea, the greater the challenges with sea lice. And traditional aquaculture of 16 to 18 months. Scottish sea farms, because we are freshwater land-based, have at a point now where our smolts are going to sea ever closer to consistently 200 grams, so 150 grams upwards. And when we moved to the 150 gram, we instantly lost 3 months growing time at sea. And you can sort of see the correlation as it goes forward. The amount of times that you need to intervene to manage sea lice control reduces as we go forward. The same thing can then be expected as we start to predict length of time in terms of the semi-contained scenarios. So this particular green line that you're seeing is reducing the time further by 2 months, and that's taking the first harvest out from the pens at 500 grams. Our plan is to then take several harvests so that you're doing 2 particular stocks of semi-containment technology in this next transition forward for us as a business. We're at a 750 gram additional months reduction at sea, and then a 1 kilogram brings us right into and under that 12-month period. Now, the reference here relates to some evidence on farms and the way that they've been operating in Norway, hence the reference here to the 1.3 kilograms, which brings you down to a 9-month period. And the back of all of this is ensuring fish health and welfare. So learning as we go in the use of these new technologies, but very clear from the studies that we've been looking at in terms of their uses elsewhere, how that will significantly support our actions in terms of mitigating our impact on wild salmon. So right across all of it, from investment in Scottish broodstock are coming from farms that have had challenges to climate change. Land-based only for us as a business in terms of fresh water, that allows us that control. Moving into the seawater stage into that same level of control, either in sea or on land, and identifying optimal sites. We have followed many farms over the last 12 years. As a business, we have grown by circa 20,000, and we've followed just over 15,000 tonnes in that period, because those farms and those locations are not optimal for the growing of farm fish, and we're giving rise to too many intervention steps. And of course, identifying locations that are further out to sea is very much part of the framework in Scotland, working with regulators who are supporting that move. I just wish they would support at greater pace, because I know where we want to move to, having done a lot of assessment environmentally, that will overcome the challenges that we've been hearing about and the concerns that you have on wild salmon. So as part of the consenting task group that the Minister referred to earlier, I'm very much trying to encourage a greater swiftness in movement to then be able to manage and address these issues. And thank you very much for your time this morning.
Anne. Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne, and we'll continue that conversation shortly. So here's a quote. We need 50% more food towards 2050, and we have used 50% of all usable land for food production, and we only have used 2% of the calories coming from the ocean, and yet we know less about the ocean than we do about space, and somewhere in these vast, deep bodies of water lies the answer to feeding the world sustainably. So says the man described recently by The Times as the Elon Musk of fish farming. He is our next speaker, Sondre Eide, who is a CEO of Eide Fjordbruck, which is owned by the Eide family, who for over 50 years have been part of and contributors to the growth and development of the salmon farming industry in Norway. He is a third-generation CEO, and he is now pioneering a type of closed pen salmon farming, which aims to have no escaped salmon and no salmon license. Put your hands together for Sondre Eide.
Thank you. I don't know if it's the right time to be linked to Elon Musk these days. But yeah, this, we call it Salmon. We created in 2018, we started the project. My father passed away, he had long-time cancer. So we created this for him and also for being a monument for sustainable seafood. So our goal is to have something that people can relate to in terms of taking risk in the ocean to produce more food, but also doing that in a way that is good for the ocean and healthy for the ocean. My grandfather started a company in 1970, and his goal was frankly to have a business. He was working in the military and was driving 2 hours each way, so he wanted just to have a business that was local. That was his motivation. And he started trout farming in the freshwater in Norway. My father was working in the oil and gas industry when that was booming in the 1970s. And his goal was also to build something, to create an industry that was sustainable, but also economically sustainable, because the industry at that time was not economically sustainable. But I think a word I can describe them was risk. They took risk, and they were not cowards. They did everything they could to move. And I think the question today is basically if we can create food for the growing population, because we have, like we're saying, towards 2050, we are 10 billion people. We need 50% more food. And we need to also, in that time, even if Donald Trump doesn't agree, we need to decline our emissions with 67%. And then we have used 50% of the land for food production. And then we have this enormous space of 71% of the Earth. And if you actually have the rest of the Earth as the bottom of an aquarium and you pump all the ocean on land, you will have an aquarium higher than Mount Everest. So the question is really if we can do this in a way, and I'm not only talking here about salmon production, but food production in generally. I think we need to increase in the ocean, but we need to do it in a way that is positive for the ocean. For me, this is what I call the enemy. And it's not only the enemy for the wild salmon, it's also the enemy for the farm salmon. It's a serial killer of fish. And not only wild, but much more actually for the farm fish, is killing much more farm fish. But I think when I came back from the US and studied in 2015, I think my perspective was that we need to kill the enemy. If we can kill the enemy, we can coexist with the wild salmon and we can grow very much needed food production. And we as farmers can actually focus on what we have not been focusing on the last 10 years. It's biology. Biology, biology, biology is what we should have used our time. And we also need to shift the focus on more sustainable feed ingredients. But because of the lice, it's taking 80% of the time. Of course, in Norway, we also have the tax coming in, taking some time, but the salmon lice is basically the enemy. And for us, what we did was we started that we're gonna take away the enemy, because that's the way we can grow the industry, and we can do that in a coexistence with the wild salmon. We started trying out different things, using a lot of data, had submergible cages, open pen net. We had something we call tube nets, where you push the fish down to 16 and 20 meters. And we also invented our own submergible cage that we did together with the Marine Institute of Norway trial. And the thing was that, yes, we could get rid of a little bit of the lice, so it functions, but you didn't eliminate it. And I think for the future growth, we need to eliminate the salmon lice, because then we can focus our effort in much other needed parts of the value chain. But we did never think about being a technology producer or being somebody doing that, because we were actually hoping that we could buy that technology. So we actually also went and bought a closed containment, and we had it in the sea, but we did not trust it enough to put our fish into it, because we see that the technology was not focused around the fish. It was more focused around being, you can call it like something that is structurally good enough. And why is that? Why is there such a huge space? And it's of course because of the regulatory framework in Norway. It's not pushing towards lice-free production. It's not pushing towards taking up the waste and bringing it away. It's pushing bringing things on, building bigger facilities on land and using the open pen nets more productively in the ocean, which is rational maybe in a very short time period. But I think if we think we think 10 years, 20 years, we need to do it in a way that is in harmony with nature and taking care of the nature and being a part of the nature. So because we didn't find anything, we started our own technology development. It was very important for us that we were not doing this that Eide means. We are a rather small family company in the red light district of Norway that was shown by Paul earlier today. But we put all our money into this project, even if there was not an economical incentive to do it. Because we did it because we think it's the only right thing to do. So we produced it, have now produced, we are on the 5th production cycle in a small scale, just finished it in a big scale as well. We had, it's pretty huge, 70 meters tall, 30 meters wide, and submerged in the water so you can tolerate waves. And I think the most interesting thing by not having lice is the discussion you have at work. You're not discussing when is the next treatment. You're not discussing how is the mortality going to be in 1 month because of the treatment. You're discussing, do you think that the fish need a stream of this or this speed? Do you think the light specter should be this or this for the salmon? And you know what's the funny part is? The best people to talk with is often the people that care the most about the wild salmon. Because it's biology, and that's what's linking us all together. Because I think in the bottom, I don't think the farmers want to have salmon lice, and I don't think they want to impact the nature negatively. But the problem is that the political and the regulatory system has not been motivating or incentivizing innovation in the sea. So when you don't have any innovation in the sea, you're becoming in a deadlock situation. So I think that if, like Paul was talking about before, if we get the regulatory framework that is kind of disrupting, if you want, the open pen nets, and it's going to get incentives to disrupt them because of productivity and that you don't have a negative impact on the nature, I think actually the farm salmon and the wild salmon could very easily coexist and actually collaborate together. But just a funny fact that we can show on the Watermoon is that we have no report. We work with Marine Institute, with the Veterinarian Institute. We want to document everything from a third-party point of view. And we see that we collect more efficiently than average land-based waste. But the funny part is that it would have been much cheaper and legal for me to just pump the waste straight into the ocean, but still I pay a lot of money to drive it and turn it into biogas. And it shouldn't be like that. Then you know that the incentives and the system is wrong when you pay much more money to get rid of the waste instead of collecting it and reusing the waste. That's just one little small thing. But I think from the Watermoon project, which Eide, as a rather small company, but we put all the effort, all the people into the project. I think also that's a key success factor in terms of succeeding. Because I think when you have people in your company that are not only producing fish, but they're also producing the home for the fish, you will have a home that is much better for the fish than if you have technology people working alone that don't understand salmon. So I think that one of the other key factors to succeed in terms of getting this technology up in a bigger scale is that we need to activate the people working on the in the ocean, on the cage, into the technology development, because they are sitting with a lot of experience that is very valuable in terms of the technology development, in terms of getting it to function in a big scale. And I don't think that the regulatory and the politician understand the impact of how long time this will take if they don't give incentives. Because it's on some location, it will take up to 5 years to use to get electricity. You should have a service industry. You should have places to build it, mount it together. And you need also to change some part of the regulatory system in terms of how you are running location and so on. So I think it's extremely important that everybody in this room and everybody that can is trying to impact that it needs to be more profitable in the end to do it the right way, to produce without salmon lice and to take the waste away and reuse it for something that is circular economy. Our result from Watermoon shows that you can do lice-free production in a very big scale, even between, we did it between 2 open pen nets locations, used to stress test it. And you show that it's also shown that you can collect waste on a very, very high level in terms of the particular waste. And since you are not doing any treatment of the fish, you will then have less mortality and more welfare. You can focus on biology. I don't think any farmer really want to treat the fish, misunderstand me right, but 60% of the mortality is directly and indirectly linked to the lice treatment, and 71 to 72%, I think the last numbers were, from the escapes are also linked, of course, when you pump fish in and out of a wellboat. So I think another point on the escape is that you can have double barriers as well. And I think it's just a matter of time, because we were talking also about the global warming. The seawater is getting warmer. So I think actually that you need close containment, not only because of the salmon lice, not only because you're going to collect waste, but I also think you need it because you need to get colder water. You need to be able to get water that doesn't have surface temperature. And I think that's also another level that you can start mimicking more of the natural habitat for the salmon, even if you are too far south in terms of the water temperature. And I think it is fully possible to coexist and actually work together. I think it's very needed because the most and best biologists are working actually almost in the river, diving in the river. I was joining them as well this year. But I think that knowledge we should get it also into the farming industry and coexist and develop together, because I think that it's 100% needed to solve the lice problem to exist in the future as fish farmers. We need to solve it. And I think that's no problem to do that if we have the right regulatory system, the right political incentives. But of course, we need the push. We need people to be positive to it, and it's not done in 2 years. If you have maybe 3 to 1, we say in Norway, a conversion rate of licenses from an open to a close, it will still take many years only because of the production capacity of technology. So it's extremely important that you have a high enough start so you get the early adapters to invest and in a kind of a way make a value chain for the late adapters in Norway. And I think the countries that are the most attractive to closed containment or lice-free and waste-free production of salmon will be the winning countries in the years to come, because innovation over time will win. And I think the best way to predict the future is to create it. So I think that it's a unique opportunity to be only 2% food from the ocean, but I think that if we want salmon to be a part of the future, we need definitely to do it in a way that is impacting the nature less, but that doesn't mean that the productivity should go down. We need more food. We need more focus on sustainable feed ingredients. So I think that we will produce much more salmon in the future, but I think the impact of the production will go down. And I think we can do that hand in hand, wild salmon and farm salmon. That's all I have. Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Could I ask our speakers to come up, please, and we'll have a discussion. Sondre, thank you. And also Robert Otto is here from the Atlantic Salmon Foundation, who's going to join the discussion as well. Thank you, Robert. And thank you for your questions that you've sent in. Okay. Anne, starting with you, you've said, I've read some interviews with you, that you care passionately about protecting our environment. Do you accept that the current way that fish farming is going in terms of your business has a negative impact on wild salmon?
I think that there is a risk, and I think, we're recognising that there is that interaction that occurs. I think it is very much about that transition that we've just heard from Sondre. The ability to shift quickly and swiftly. I think it's a multi-party approach to it, as I've indicated, and investing into the right spaces, ensuring that you're undertaking the action at every stage within our farming cycle to minimise as much as possible that time period at this moment in the sector's stage is really important within the sea. So reducing that impact.
And sorry to push you here, Anne, but is that a yes? I mean, do you accept that, the scientific research is there. Do you accept that fish farming has a negative impact on wild salmon?
I think I've been really clear. I worked very closely in the Salmon Interactions Working Group, along with 2 other colleagues from the Scottish sector, where we understand clearly those 3 pressures that have been identified, and that the hazard that salmon farming poses to it is then accepting that that hazard is present. How best then can you manage the risk? How can you, to what actions should you take? When should you take them? At what pace can you take them then to reduce that negative impact that's arising from any activity that's giving pressure? Yeah.
So when you see this closed system here, the technology that's being developed, are you panicking, thinking that they're going right ahead, we're going to be left behind, we're the horses while the motor cars are on the motorway, and we're yesterday's business?
No, not at all, actually. I found Sondre's presentation very inspiring. I will not sit here and say I wasn't somewhat envious of the ability to be able to take those steps and actions. But I think it is around how can you move the dial, and how quickly can you do it to get to that point. As I explained, the steps and stages of introducing the containment system to manage at a stage within the fish cycle is really, really critical, and that's very much part of the Scottish Sea Farms farming strategy, as I understand it, is other businesses across the sector.
And how much of your profits are you investing in closed pen technology?
Oh, you're asking the wrong person. I don't have the number completely to date, but I'm happy to come back and answer and provide you content.
But you are investing in looking at...
Ultimately, nothing that I've put up has not been signed off as a direction of travel for our business. To be clear, the semi-containment technology in the unit that you saw, it's just an example that's available to you on the web. Those units, their energy requirements is the equivalent to a standard Scottish salmon farm, which itself is only about 1,700 tonnes as opposed to the sort of Norwegian average of 3,400. The cost of those units is 5 million per pen. And so that phased approach is absolutely part of the business strategy that we have, as is moving our farms into locations that are away from the areas of salmon migration.
And we heard this morning from the Norwegian minister, I mean, we're in an existential crisis with wild salmon. Would you accept that?
I think
don't
it's
have very
incredibly
long.
concerning that what you see and what you hear, absolutely. Very concerning, and action is required, and indeed, that's what I'm continuing to state, action now at pace and enabling the transition of the sector to places that we understand are better for the growing of fish and the fish health and welfare, be of farmed and of wild, and the complementary action that then presents for protecting wild salmon.
Paul, when you look at Anne's presentation and the suggestions and where they're going in the industry, what do you think?
Well, I saw you had the Salmar Ocean Farm as one of the possibilities. We must admit that we're very afraid of that kind of solutions because it only takes the old open net technology in the bigger scale onto the open ocean. And what do we know about the open ocean? Accidents do happen. It's always happened, and it will continue to happen. And we had 2 or 3 small accidents with the Salmar Ocean Farm already in Trondheim. That's inshore. If you go offshore, the consequences would be much bigger. And you can have like 1 million escapees from one sunken offshore farm. That would be disastrous for the wild salmon. So last year we had officially I say, 100,000 escapees in Norway. I think the number might be 4 or 5 times that high because even the Ministry of Fisheries don't accept the numbers of escaped salmon given by the farmers. So the genetic influence from escaped fish is very big already. We don't need any more.
So for you, the water moon, that future is where you want things to go, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Robert, can you give your thoughts on Anne's presentation and that sort of halfway house between what she is putting forward as a solution and what Sondre has put forward?
Well, I think that, the last day and a half has reminded us all of the crisis that seems we're in and is accelerating. I think that the aquaculture industry and what I've heard today, there seems to be an openness to shifting production methods to more closed containment, which I think is a step in the right direction. However, I haven't heard anything that explains to me how that transition can happen quickly enough along the timelines of what wild salmon need. And that's greatly concerning to me. My experience is most familiar with the Eastern Canadian situation where almost all of the net pens that are in the water are open net pens. And we know of the impacts that they have on wild salmon, and I think that's clear. Eastern Canada seems to be a little bit behind some of what I'm hearing today, but the biggest concern I have is just the timeline about that kind of transition, and does that line up with what we need for wild salmon? I would also point out that when I think about this at a very high level and step back, I'm frustrated, amazed that the lens that we refuse to look at this issue through is what is it exactly that wild salmon require, and build or transition the industry to around that lens. And certainly the Eastern Canadian context, we are certainly not there. And I don't see it happening quickly enough.
And so when you look at the water moon and what Sondre is doing, what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's some great possibility there. I think it's better if it's able to be taken to scale, for sure. One of the concerns, of course, is that we don't know what the eventual problems might be with that kind of approach. And we at the Atlantic Salmon Federation wrestle a lot with, you know, do we go to the end of the spectrum and say, get out of the water, get on land? And people will approach us and say, well, that's not going to happen. There's no way we can bring the production up to scale in time, and I realize that. But for all the investment that it would take to move to a closed containment, the concern is that once that investment is made, you're stuck with it for a period of time. And if it turns out to be not great for wild salmon, then what do we do?
Sondre, can I ask you, you said you put all your money into it. How much money did you put into that?
I don't know exactly the numbers, but more than my finance person is happy. That's for sure. So he say, but yeah.
Ballpark, what are we talking about? I mean,
a lot of money, many, like I would say, many hundred millions, like 500 million Norwegian NOK at least. Yeah.
Wow.
But yes, for the development and for the testing and everything, so a lot of money.
Are you sure it can work at scale?
I am sure it can work at scale, but we did this without having a regulatory framework for it to function. I've been saying before, we're going to shift all our open pen nets into the closed containment if you give me 1 to 3, and if you give me a regulatory that I can have brackish 1 unit at the time, so I can have a fabric mentality, then I will shift it in 5 years.
And the unforeseen possibilities and impacts, how are you going to look at that? I mean, are you working with biologists to make sure that suddenly some other problem doesn't pop up?
Yeah, for me it's frustrating that we have so much money into the going into scientific. You need to use the scientific people like Marine Institute and the Veterinary Institute. They need to be ahead of the curve. So let's say that we take away the salmon, then we don't need the salmon lice. Then we don't need to use money into R&D and scientific project on the salmon lice. We need to say, what are the new problems that are coming? What is the new difficulties we need to overcome? Like feed ingredients will be an obvious one, but another one is like bacteria from the deep. We need to find out the hydro streams in the fjords. There's so many things, but the money today are going only on salmon lice, so that nobody is working ahead of the curve, if you know what I mean. So of course there will be a problem, we need to fix it.
And so when you talk about incentives, what exactly are you talking about? I mean, what exactly do you want the Norwegian government to do for you?
In a perfect world, you will have, this is the impact you can have on the nature, but how much you produce is not applicable to the license. It's more like, how much do I impact the nature? And then everybody then will work on innovation in terms of how do we do less impact, that is increasing the productivity with the lower costs. Over time, then you will have innovation, and the countries making a regulatory framework around that will, of course, then win, because then they will have the innovation and the money spent in their territory.
I mean, when you hear Paul's suggestion of this exchange of permits in order to expand closed technology, and each permit is 21 million, I mean, you've just said $500 million there in terms of investment, so I'm not sure how far 21 million would go.
No, I think like, but I think the problem is not I think the risk capital is there, and I think Paul you have a look at that you put like 1 license in and then you get X license back, but I think like there should not be, I agree with the parameter and we agree on how it, but I think it's for the development of the future, it should be like impact less, have better welfare and produce more. That should be the easiest step.
Just 21 million euros. So that's almost 250 million kroner.
No.
So that's half the money he has used for the development.
Okay. So. The regulation, Sondre, as well. Talk about the regulation. I mean, you give good examples in terms of taking the waste out, and there's many examples I can think of something similar in Ireland where it is actually cheaper to pollute than it is to do the right thing. How realistic is it that you can get that regulatory change?
The politicians just need to have the law and then approve it, and then we're going to follow it up and implement and fix it. And I think all the farmers are keen to do it, because you can say that, but I think every farmer, they want to do the best for the fish initially. But then it's maybe like a little bit fight that we should go here or here. But I think if the politicians say, this is the road, then you will have everybody follow. So I think it will happen as quickly as it possibly can happen, but it needs to be more profitable to be earlier mover than to be waiting and sitting in the waiting game, if you know what I mean. So you need to trigger away so people are running in that direction and not saying, okay, I don't know if it's worth the risk. Let's say it's like in between. So it's safer to use weight, let the other people develop the technology, and then we also get fish and the salmon lice out of the water, so we can produce even cheaper with less treatment in the open pen net. That if the conversion rate or if it's too little, that trigger mechanism in terms of taking the step towards close containment or lice-free production, then you will have a waiting game. So I think it's all about having a high, it should be a great incentives in the beginning, and then you should maybe make it smaller and smaller if you go further in the time ahead, because it's all about getting technology shift, getting the worth up and running, the technology service industry. It's a lot of things in the value chain that needs to be improved. Even like we talk about the waste. The waste today, I'm not proud of it, but this is how it is. We drive it with boat to Denmark for biogas production. Norway, it should be, of course, like we have like a big oil refinery that we can develop from oil and gas, which we need to do anyway, into like waste and use that for cleaner production, something like that.
Are you frustrated by the lack of innovation in your industry? I mean, what would you ask? You're speaking a lot about regulation and incentives from the government, but what about within the industry?
I feel like a marathon runner around a treadmill never can do a race because the regulatory is not good enough. But I think in the industry it's a positive shift. I think it takes time because it's a very traditional industry with very long-term thinking, and it sounds funny when I say it that way, but it's actually like that. So I think it's coming, and I think the industry is very rational. So if it's more profitable to produce without lice, they will do it as fast as they can.
Robert, I suppose the danger is that by the time that happens, the salmon will be extinct, and the industry then will be able just to carry on. I mean, is it
yes.
time?
So that's definitely a concern. I mean, the longer that you put off making changes that you know are coming, the more severe they need to be when the time comes that you get there. One of the issues, of course, when we're dealing with companies and business and an economic model that is, to us, has a lot of questions is, it's impossible to make that shift quickly. When pressed to. I agree with Sondre that regulation would help. What I do also believe is that certainly the jurisdictions in like Canada and other countries, who have made commitments internationally around the industry of open net pen, and yet we don't see it actually happening within those jurisdictions. I do attend NASCO meetings, and I know that under the implementation planning process at NASCO, all of the large aquaculture producing nations, salmon producing nations, are uniformly poor performers when it comes to the review of their implementation plans. Either partially or not successful at all.
You have heard Paul's suggestion. He's come forward to suggest what needs to happen and to come up with a solution and offer it up. Is it time, do you think, that the environmental NGOs start getting behind that urgently? Given the perfect not being the enemy of good. The idea that actually there's very little time, we're on a route to extinction now, closed pen technology needs to happen. Let's support the Sondres of the world to make that happen. For sure.
Paul and I have been speaking in the last couple of days, and I'm very much intrigued by what he's talking about. The Atlantic Salmon Federation in Canada, we challenged ourselves to how can we open up a dialogue with the aquaculture industry, because where we are right now is not working. And so we modified our position. We said, okay, where you're operating now, okay, but let's not have expansion until we can figure out what the solutions are to the areas where you're working now. And unfortunately, we approached the aquaculture industry with that proposal, and we're told that they weren't interested in speaking with us. So we move and we're rebuffed. And so, you know, eventually if you have to move so far to open up that conversation, I don't think you're going to be successful in saving wild salmon.
And you saw the graph that Paul put up about the threats to wild salmon, escape farm salmon, sea lice, infections related to fish farming. Do you accept that science?
Well, I appreciate that that's the Norwegian-specific assessment. There is something very similar that has been done in Scotland by Marine Directorate. There are different, as I spoke earlier, about understanding the differences in a geographical and locational aspect, but equally understanding the way that a sector operates within that space is really important. And there is a distinct difference that has occurred historically over the years. So consequently, the same box, I think, you know, with the graph and the reference of pressures, actually shows differently within the Scottish context.
So you don't think that's the case?
It's not a mirror. Well, what I'm saying is you asked me a question about Paul's graph. So the same assessment matrix has been done in Scotland, and there is an acceptance of that pressure, the answer to the earlier question, but it is not at the scale of so it's not a like-for-like scenario. Particularly, you know, with that presumption in the north and east coast in Scotland, 80 to 88% of the wild salmon population are not emerging into the aquaculture zone, and therefore there are different pressures of greater significance within the Scottish arena. That does not mean that the aquaculture farming sector should not be addressing its pressures, but it is a different
I just wonder what the incentives are for your industry to protect the wild salmon. I mean, it'd be a stain on your reputation if it goes extinct, or is it actually a holding pattern until it goes extinct and it's kind of easier to operate?
Absolutely, categorically not. I think one of the key things is understanding what has been in the past, and we can't do anything about that. So what do you change as you go forward? And I would suggest that we all have reflections around the work that we've done and what that means going forward. But I think fundamentally I am not an angler myself. I attempted very early at the age of 7 and failed miserably and didn't have the patience to stick it through. But I work with many colleagues who could as easily be you sitting in this audience, who are passionate anglers, passionate in conservation. I lead a department of environmentalists around biodiversity and nature positive. Recently discovered how difficult it is to get a nature conservation project for oysters. I didn't think it was possible to struggle greater than getting a salmon farm development within Scottish waters. Biodiversity actions are at the heart of what we're doing as a business. It complements farming. And
it would be a huge stain on the reputation if there was a local extinction within your area.
I mean, ultimately,
of the wild salmon.
And you're pushing me in a direction. Ultimately, it is of no interest in any salmon sector business that I've been speaking to have a scenario that impacts on such an iconic species that you know, has enabled the emergence of farm salmon.
Paul, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the model used by the scientific advisory committee. It's internationally published. It's solid science, and I think it should be applied in all the Norske countries. And one of the good things about Norway, we have a very transparent system. We have also Barents Watch, where you can go in and see all the parameters regarding all the different locations for aquaculture. This is something you don't have in Canada. You should have it. And these are things we could export easily. And then if Norske could say, okay, use this system, then we could see how much impact the sea lice or the escapees would have in Scotland.
I think I need to come back on that one. The process that the Marine Directorate went through was as robust as the process undertaken in Norway. Both Scotland and Norwegian regulators speak to each other, and policymakers and scientists. The Scottish system has a very out-of-date aquaculture website that is groaning under the volume of data that is there, and was the first sector to actually publish our data globally. I very much value and use the Barents Watch to understand what's happening in Norway. And of course, there's been a call for greater transparency. Actually, it's greater understanding of what is a huge amount of data and very difficult to understand in the way that the Barents Watch platform enables, and it is a very fabulous representation and accessibility of data that does exist within the UK and the Scottish sector, but I'm afraid it's Excel spreadsheets and you've got to try and figure your way through it.
And the Ferret online journalists had to go to FOI to get the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency figures that show that fish farms have broken environmental rules more than 100 times in the last 2 years, 22 for Scottish sea farms. So we're talking about pesticide misuse, seabed pollution, excessive numbers of fish, misplaced fish cages and all the rest. I mean, it doesn't quite add up to the idea of stewardship and sustainability.
I think, again, understanding, if you pose a question to the Scottish regulator, and indeed in 2018 I was the Scottish regulator being posed that question in Parliament around the environmental performance of the sector, you look at the compliance with a total list of conditions in a licence. In unpicking that question, what is the environmental performance of the sector in terms of its interactions with its seabed, within its water spaces and the like, is a far different answer to that. And I think I referenced earlier the 98% compliance that we have had over the last 5 years and continue to have, not resting on that. I won't be happy until it's 100%. Around our actual environmental impact in the spaces, as opposed to some of the administrative elements. And I'm afraid you've asked a question of an ex-regulator. I well understand the purposes of conditions, but I question when we're actually being asked specific questions around what is important, where are we focusing. And I think there is a need and a shift to ensure that we are focusing in the right places.
It's in the public interest, surely, to have all that information freely available and transparent. I presume you agree with that?
Absolutely. SEPA suffered a cyber attack. It's really simple. They don't have the database system to be able to press the button.
Can I fly through some of the questions from the audience as well? Sondre, you might be able to answer this. Why aren't farm fish infertile? This would eliminate one of the major risks of fish farming.
We actually had a project with that in like triploid fish, but that was because of the welfare. They stopped that project before. It was like 10 years ago, I think. So I think you have had a process on that, but I think there is somebody working also with some kind of enzyme and some stuff. So I think it could happen, but it's not there today.
Anne, the salmon industry's reliance on wild fish as feed is driving overfishing of fish populations that are already vulnerable to climate change and taking food away from communities around the world, including West Africa. I presume that's a reference to the UK-based NGO feedback that found that salmon farms are taking huge amounts of wild fish from West Africa in fish meal and fish oil imported from countries like Senegal and all the rest. How do you square that with your industry's stated growth ambitions? It's hitting up against its biological limits.
All I can speak to is how the Scottish salmon sector acquire their fish meal and fish oils. And there is no Scottish business that, so the reference you're making to West Africa doesn't...
You don't source from West Africa?
No, we do not. There is no business in Scotland that does that. In terms of the ensuring that the feed and the feed provision is conserving as much as we can the fish meal and fish oil. Bearing in mind, we've talked about what does a wild salmon need. We also need to remember that farm salmon in the lifetime of food production are not that far away from their origin part. So what do a farm salmon need? They are a marine carnivore, so the diet needs to reflect a certain quantity of marine ingredients, and it's therefore ensuring that you're minimising and sourcing those ingredients from sustainable and certified sustainable fisheries. As a business, we withdrew from the blue whiting. I always have to hesitate with that one in terms of the North Atlantic catch, because there is no agreed quota for that species, and therefore you cannot then measure how you're impacting the sustainability of a fishery. So ensuring that
you don't source from West Africa?
We absolutely do not, no. And it's something that keeps coming back, and I keep having to answer that one, but we definitely do not.
What will it take for your company to move away from open net pens?
I think Sondre has sort of eloquently described the sort of path and the logistics around doing it. I've described a path where we're transitioning and adopting technology where we're comfortable that technology can support the health and welfare of fish. That is absolutely core element of any farmer, is to ensure that animal welfare is there. And doing it in such a way that obviously then supports the welfare of the environment around it, including those species within it. So I think there is something around the logistics. I've already spoken earlier about the ability for regulators to support and expedite relocation of farms to places that are less impactful, that are more supportive of welfare and survival, particularly as we understand the changing seas. But I also think there is a real difficulty on logistics. So I appreciate.
So it's not going to happen in your case anytime soon at all?
I can assure you, I am, as an ex-waste inspector, it breaks my heart the volume of organic product that could be going to fertilise some of the very fields that we then get our feed from. And from a circularity perspective, it is a resource of immense value, but how do we then get to the point where you're able to balance, move the sector forward in that way for all the benefits we've already spoken about?
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry, we can't take any questions because we're between you and your lunch, and there's nothing worse than a hungry audience. You need to be back here at 2:15. Please put your hands together to thank the panel. Thank you.